Welcome back to History Mark. I'm glad you're here. The case for today comes from the frontier territories of Tennessee and Kentucky in the final years of the 18th century. The two men at the center of it were known across the American frontier as Big Harp and Little Harp. Their real names were Micajah and Wiley. And this is what is known about what they did across 4 states in the years between 1797 and 1804, and why the American frontier has remembered them ever since as the first serial killers in the history of the United States. If you're enjoying these forgotten cases, please like the video and subscribe. It really helps this channel grow. To understand who the Harp brothers were, you have to understand the world they operated in. The American frontier of the 1790s was not a country in the way we would recognize the word today. The United States of America was a new nation, less than 20 years old, and the territory beyond the settled eastern states was a world that the law had not yet reached in any reliable way. The roads through Kentucky and Tennessee were not really roads. They were narrow tracks through dense forest, cut through the mountains and the canebrakes by the feet of generations of travelers. The most important of them was the Wilderness Road, which ran from the Cumberland Gap through central Kentucky toward the Ohio River, and which was, in the 1790s, the main artery of westward migration in North America. Every week, hundreds of families, traders, land speculators, and adventurers moved along it, carrying their money, their goods, and their livestock toward the new territories. There was no police force to protect them. There was no communication system that would let anyone know quickly if a traveler had failed to arrive. If a man disappeared along the Wilderness Road, the most likely conclusion the people who noticed his absence would draw was that he had simply moved on further west. For the first several years of the Harp brothers' campaign of murder, this was the condition that made them almost impossible to catch. They killed people whom no one would miss for weeks or months, in a landscape where the evidence could be hidden under 3 feet of river water with a handful of stones. The two men who came to be called the Harp brothers were not, by the most careful historical analysis, brothers at all. They were cousins. Micajah Harpe, known as Big Harp, had been born as Joshua Harper, the son of John Harper, a Scottish immigrant who had settled in Orange County, North Carolina, before the Revolutionary War. Wiley Harpe, known as Little Harp, had been born as William Harper, the son of John Harper's brother William. The two of them had grown up together in North Carolina and had remained together as close as brothers for their entire adult lives. The name Harp, by which they would eventually be known across 4 states, was a shortening of the family surname that had stuck as they had traveled further and further from the communities where people knew their real names. Their first documented involvement in organized violence came during the American Revolutionary War. Both of them sided with the British Crown in a frontier where loyalties were divided and where the men who chose the losing side paid for it in everything they subsequently owned. They were attached to a loyalist raiding gang in North Carolina, and the accounts of that gang's activities in the period literature and the depositions that survive from the war years describe a group that committed violence against Patriot settlers well beyond anything that military necessity could have justified. By the time the war ended and the British cause was lost, the Harps had already established, in the communities where they had operated, a reputation for enjoying the violence rather than simply engaging in it. In the years that followed the war, they moved south and west. They drifted through Virginia. They reappeared in the settlements of East Tennessee around the town of Knoxville, sometime around 1795. They arrived, as they always did, with the women. There were 3 of them: Sally Rice, the daughter of a minister who was attached to Wiley, Susan Wood and Betsy Roberts, both attached to Micajah simultaneously, in what the frontier communities they passed through described variously as a marriage arrangement, a domestic partnership, and a captivity. The historical record does not settle clearly and definitively whether the 3 women were with the Harps by choice or by coercion. What it does record is that all three of them stayed with the men through years of violence and hardship that gave them every opportunity to leave, and that all three were eventually found by the authorities not as victims but as members of the traveling household. What they knew and when they knew it is one of the case's most enduring unanswered questions. The Harps tried, briefly, to lease either's ordinary frontier settlers near Knoxville. They farmed, or at least they lived on a farm. They were not cut out for it. By 1798, neighbors had begun to accuse them of stealing livestock. Charges were filed. The Harps were run out of the community. It was this expulsion from the settlement at Knoxville in the early months of 1798 that triggered the sequence of events that would make their names last for 2 centuries. The first murders that can be documented with reasonable confidence occurred in 1797 along the Wilderness Road, before the Knoxville expulsion. 3 travelers disappeared in succession, each one having been last seen in the general area where the Harps were living. Their bodies were found in nearby streams, weighted down with stones, and in one case stuffed into a hollow tree. The method of body disposal the Harps had developed was a distinctive one that would eventually serve as one of the strongest pieces of evidence linking multiple killings to the same perpetrators. They would open the body of a victim and fill the cavity with rocks and gravel before placing it in the water. It was a method that reflected a practical knowledge of the frontier. They understood that a body thrown into a river will float unless the cavity that holds air is filled with something heavier. The bodies they prepared this way did not float. Several of them were never found. The number of people the Harps actually killed between 1797 and 1799 has never been established with certainty. The estimates in the historical record range from 25 to 50 or more. Through the autumn and winter of 1798, the killings continued across Kentucky. A man named John Langford, traveling from Virginia to Kentucky, turned up dead. The tavern keeper whose establishment Langford had visited before his death told the authorities that the Harps had been at the same tavern, that they had made Langford's acquaintance, and that they had left in the same direction as him. The authorities began to move. On Christmas Day 1798, a Kentucky posse caught up with the Harp household in Hustonville and arrested them. All 3 women were pregnant at the time of the arrest. 2 of them gave birth in jail that winter. The household, 2 wanted men, 3 women, and a collection of newborn infants, was taken to the town of Danville to await trial for murder. They did not wait for long. In March 1799, the Harps broke out of the Danville jail. They left their women and children behind. On their way out of the county, they killed the young son of a man who had cooperated with the investigation. The killing of a child in direct retaliation for a parent's cooperation with the law sent a message to every community they subsequently passed through. To inform against the Harps was to put your own family in the ground. The Kentucky governor, James Garrard, issued warrants for their arrest and a reward of $300 on each of their heads, a sum roughly equivalent to several $1,000s in modern currency. The governor's warrant contained the only formal physical description of the 2 men that survives in the historical record. McCarger, it said, was approximately 6 feet tall, powerfully built, and around 30 years of age. Wiley was shorter and thinner, with a wild head of reddish hair. Anyone who saw them together, the warrant implied, would have little difficulty identifying them. After breaking out of Danville, the Harps headed west toward the Ohio River and one of the most notorious locations on the American frontier, a place called Cave-in Rock, on the southern bank of the Ohio River in what is now Illinois. Cave-in Rock was a natural limestone cave in the riverbank, large enough to shelter a substantial group of people, and it had become, by the 1790s, the base of operations of a gang of river pirates who preyed on the flatboats and traders moving goods along the Ohio. The cave's residents were some of the most dangerous men on the frontier, men who had no compunctions about violence or robbery. The Harpers stayed at Cave-in Rock for a brief period. They were asked to leave. Even the community of river pirates, men who had themselves committed murders and robberies across the Ohio Valley, found the Harps too indiscriminately violent to be useful. being ejected from a cave full of pirates for excessive violence is one of the more remarkable details in the entire history of American frontier crime. They moved back into Kentucky and continued east. Through the summer of 1799, the bodies continued to appear along the roads and in the streams of central Kentucky, and the posses continued to form and fail to find them. It was in August of 1799 that Muhammad Harpe committed the act that, in his own dying words, was the only one of all his killings that he ever regretted. His infant daughter, one of the children born to the women in the Harpe household, would not stop crying. He killed her to silence her. He later confessed this to the men who caught him. He told them that of all the people he had killed, of all the men and women and children whose deaths he had caused from North Carolina to the Ohio River, the death of his own daughter was the only one that had troubled him. Every other death had left him, by his own account, entirely unmoved. Only this one. In August 1799, the Harpes took shelter at a farmhouse in Webster County, Kentucky, belonging to a man named Moses Stegall. Stegall was away from the home at the time. In the house with Mrs. Stegall and their 4-month-old infant was an overnight guest, a man named Major William Love. In the night, the Harpes killed Major Love. The accounts of why differ slightly between sources. The most commonly cited reason is that Love's snoring disturbed them. In the morning, the infant boy was crying. He was silenced by the same means his crying had provoked. When Mrs. Stegall raised her voice in protest at what had been done to her child, she was killed as well. The Harpes set fire to the cabin and left. Moses Stegall returned home to find his house in ashes and his family gone. His neighbors helped him recover the bodies. He was told by the people who had seen the Harpes on the road which direction they had gone. He joined the posse that had already been pursuing them and rode with them at its head. The posse was led by a frontiersman named John Liper. On August 24, 1799, Liper's group caught up with the Harpes in Webster County. They demanded the two men surrender. The Harpes refused and attempted to run. Liper shot Muhammad Harpe from horseback, striking him in the spine. He fell from his horse and could not rise. Wily Harpe, lighter and faster, escaped into the forest and disappeared. Muhammad Harpe lay on the ground, dying slowly from the wound in his back. He was surrounded by the men who had been hunting him for months. Among them was Moses Stegall. As Muhammad lay bleeding in the long grass of Webster County, he talked. He confessed to more than 20 killings across Tennessee, Illinois, and Kentucky. He described where some of the bodies had been put. He expressed regret for precisely one of those killings. The men around him listened. One of them, Stegall, had something else in mind. When the confession was complete, Moses Stegall took a knife and cut off the head of Muhammad Harpe. The sources differ on exactly when in the process life had departed, but several accounts, including one by John Liper himself, state plainly that the act was completed before Muhammad Harpe had stopped breathing. Stegall had not ridden with a posse across Kentucky in August heat to extend mercy to the man who had killed his family. The head was taken back to the road and placed on a spike at a crossroads in Henderson County, Kentucky. It was displayed there for years. The intersection where it stood is still known today, 225 years later, by the name the local people gave it. It is called Harp's Head Road. Wily Harpe, who had escaped into the forest when his companion fell, disappeared for several years. He adopted a new name, John Seton, and he rejoined the world of frontier outlawry in the only place available to him after his years with the Harpes, the organized criminal networks operating along the Natchez Trace in Tennessee and Mississippi. He attached himself to the gang of a notorious river pirate and bandit named Samuel Mason, and for the next 4 years he robbed and killed travelers along the trace under his assumed name. And nobody who encountered him in that world appears to have immediately recognized him as one of the two men whose heads the state of Kentucky had been willing to pay $300 apiece to see on a pole. The manner in which Wily Harpe finally came to justice is one of the more extraordinary single moments in the history of American frontier crime. By 1803, the Mississippi territorial authorities had offered a reward of $2,000 for the capture or the severed head of Samuel Mason himself. Wiley Harpe, calculating that $2,000 was a more reliable income than anything else available to him on the Natchez Trace, killed Samuel Mason and cut off his head. He put the head in a ball of clay to preserve it and carried it to the nearest authorities to claim the reward. He was recognized the moment he presented the head. The man standing in front of the territorial officers with a dead gang leader's head in a ball of clay in his hands was not John Seton. He was Little Harp, one of the two most wanted men the frontier had produced in a generation, who had somehow believed that years under a false name in a different state had made him safe to walk into a government office and ask for $2,000. He was arrested. He escaped briefly. He was recaptured within hours. He was tried in Jefferson County in the Mississippi Territory, convicted, and hanged on the 8th of February, 1804, 5 years after his companion had died on the grass in Webster County, Kentucky. His head, like McCarger's before him, was cut from his body after death and placed on a stake along the Natchez Trace as a warning to the outlaws who used that road. It was the same end that had found his companion, in the same manner, in a different state. The road eventually grew wider and moved toward the spot where the stake had been, and the grave of Wiley Harpe was eventually absorbed into the surface of the highway. There is not much left of him. The 3 women who had traveled with the Harpes through the years of the killing were investigated and questioned, but never convicted. They were examined by justices in Kentucky and sent before a grand jury on charges of accessory to the killings at the Stiegel cabin, but no trial resulted. They returned, in the years that followed, to something resembling ordinary life. One of them, Sally Rice, eventually remarried and raised her children in Kentucky. What they had known and when, and what exactly their participation in the events of those years had been, was never established in any court and has never been satisfactorily answered by the historical record. They are one of the case's most enduring mysteries. The Harpes killed somewhere between 39 and 50 or more people across 4 states in the span of less than a decade. The precise number will never be known because the method of disposal they used, the weighted bodies in the rivers and the hollow trees, meant that many victims were never found. They killed men, they killed women, they killed children, they killed strangers, and they killed people who had shown them hospitality. They killed, by every account that has come down to us from the period, not for money. They rarely took anything of significant value, and not for survival, but because they had decided, sometime in the years of the Revolutionary War or before it, that the people around them had no more claim on their mercy than the animals of the forest. There is a word we use now for people who kill repeatedly, across jurisdictions and over years, without financial motive and without remorse. The word was not available in 1799. But the thing it describes was walking the Wilderness Road and the Natchez Trace and leaving bodies in the streams of 4 American states, and Moses Stegall and John Liper and the men of the Kentucky frontier understood what it was, even if they did not yet have the language for it. Tell me in the comments what you think of the 3 women who traveled with the Harpes across Kentucky and Tennessee. Were they victims of 2 violent men, too afraid and too dependent to leave? Or did they know what was happening around them and choose to stay? The historical record has never settled that question. I read every reply. Thank you for being here. The channel will see you again in the next one. History Mark.